It is top of the hour, and I am back in my chair. I've been hiding
There you
for a
go.
few weeks. And hey, everybody, you're on Lunch Conversations with Randy and Teddy. I'm in my new studio. I hired some really sophisticated producers to help me put it together. No, I didn't. So anyway, Randy's my co-host, partner in crime on the show. And our special guest today is John Moskop, and we'll introduce you to him momentarily. If you've not been on or seen our Lunch Conversations with Randy and Teddy show, we're all about bringing you some really interesting, diverse conversations that can make you think, make you ponder where you are, what you're doing. And oh my God, I had no freaking idea that people do that stuff. That's what we're all about. That's a pretty good little segue, Randy. A little bit different.
Pretty. And we're up and running, by the way, too, Teddy, on both Facebook and LinkedIn.
So those
you done good over there.
I try my best, man. For those that have ever met me, I'm Teddy. I'm a LinkedIn strategist. I teach LinkedIn as a business tool globally, all over the world. That's the same thing as globally, right? And I love helping sales teams and marketing departments and individuals who want to figure out how to use that tool a little differently. And it's okay. It's okay by me for our special guest to be on the show here and not be using LinkedIn. No harm, no foul there at all. So Randy, introduce yourself to people, then take over, buddy.
Yeah, Teddy. And I didn't get the memo on the dress code. I would have worn my, I think I have a bow tie. I also have a string tie. Like back in the Hank Williams days. Yeah, one of those. I have one of those. Mm-hmm. And looks like we've got another.
I'll manage that. I got
all right. We've got that. But yeah, Randy Wooden with Goodwill Industries of Northwest North Carolina, director for our professional center. We are a 31 county Goodwill. I bet you didn't know that. We've got workforce development centers throughout our footprint to include a professional center based here in Winston. That I run. So if you or maybe somebody you know is in a job search and maybe you're a professional or you aspire to work in a professional environment, reach out. Our services, as always, are free. Happy to get you on the calendar. And each week, except the last couple of weeks, Teddy, because you were MIA on me. But every week,
but Randy, I do aspire to be a professional.
Well, it's good to know, Teddy. If you have the want to, I can teach you the how to. If you trust me to do all that, then that was your first mistake. So, no, just kidding, folks. But yeah, Teddy was gone the last couple of weeks, so he's back. I did not authorize any bump in pay. He was on strike for a couple of weeks, but he's back. So I'm glad of that, Teddy. We appreciate Cindy Martin filling in and just really had a good show last week, but a good show again this week. Dr. John Moskop's going to join us, and John's on the screen there. But before we get too deep into the conversation about what John does and his background, I want to encourage folks to put your comments and questions in the chat. Teddy will keep an eye on that. And each week we try to bring in interesting guests and topics, and this week's no different. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we're going to try to cover today. And then, John, I'll throw it to you for a longer introduction. But John is by title, Professor of Internal Medicine, and also the Wallace and Mona Wu Chair in Biomedical Ethics. He's with the School of Medicine at Wake Forest University, among other things you're involved with. But we're going to cover some pretty cool topics today. Bioethics, clinical ethics. From a physician's standpoint, what's their role in engaging with whether patients or maybe their loved ones about everything from end-of-life issues to all kinds of topics. Healthcare as a right. We're going to talk about abortion. We're going to talk a little bit about maybe cloning, stem cell research, euthanasia, you name it. A lot of this stuff is hot button issues. And so we're not going to get into the weeds about advocating one way or the other, but more so from a clinical standpoint. So just keep that in mind with your comments and so forth. Try to keep the political fray to a minimum if we can. Is that possible, John?
I'm not sure.
We'll try it. John, why don't you introduce yourself a little more detail for us?
Sure. So as you shared my titles,
Yep.
So I am a faculty member in the School of Medicine and work here in the medical center. I'm also the chair of the medical center's clinical ethics committee, and so I sort of direct the various tasks that are assigned to that committee. Up until very recently, I have taught both medical students in required courses in the medical undergraduate curriculum here at Wake Forest, and also in the bioethics graduate program, which is a graduate school program at Wake Forest University. So those are, and of course, I do some writing and research contributing to scholarship in the field of clinical ethics. So those
You
are the
also have a book out too, right? Don't you
yes,
have it?
yeah.
As luck would have it, it's right by side you. Why don't you show folks?
Sure,
what it
sure,
is?
I will. So
There you
this is
go.
a book that I published
right.
years back. It's a basic textbook in bioethics,
Mhm.
and it's
Yeah.
published by a leading academic press, like Cambridge University Press. So I was really fortunate to be able to write and publish this, and it's a book that I have used in my teaching of medical students and medical residents and graduate students.
Lot to dive in. Again, if you have comments or questions for John, put them in the chat area. So I always ask the why question about someone's passion and drive. And you've been at this most of your career involved in bioethics before really it was a thing, I suppose. And we'll cover that a little bit more.
Yeah.
But what was it that got you started down this path?
Well, it was a sort of a happy accident.
Okay.
I did a major undergraduate program, a kind of great books program at Notre Dame, and was really drawn to philosophy. So I decided to go to graduate school in philosophy and ended up at the University of Texas at Austin. But bioethics was not on my radar because bioethics really was just emerging as a separate field of study. This is back in the 1970s. But one spring afternoon, I think about 1976, a friend and a fellow graduate student approached me and said, "Hey, John, how would you like a summer job?" And I said, "Well, I didn't have a summer job." So I said, "Tell me about it." And he said, "Well, I've been working as a research assistant for this guy at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, Texas, the medical school there. And I can't work for him anymore because I'm graduating and going on to my own teaching job. So he needs a research assistant. Would you be interested?" And he said, "He's a really charismatic guy. He's a great teacher. I think you'd enjoy working with him." So I said, "Okay." And my friend was right. I mean, I was fascinated by the moral issues that he was exploring in healthcare. And I was convinced that these were issues that were of great importance and practical issues. And that made it really attractive to me. So when I finished my doctoral studies, I applied for faculty positions in this new field. And with the help of my mentor, I was offered a position at the brand new medical school at East Carolina University. That had just started in the late 1970s.
Okay.
So I accepted the job and taught at East Carolina for almost 30 years. So it was a great place for me to work and live. And then in 2009, I decided to move and accepted a job that I applied for here at Wake Forest and have been here in Winston-Salem ever since. So that's a quick sort of review of
the quick run of a few decades. So it's been with you for a long time. So let's start with some definitions here. I always like to define our terms. And so we're going to ask you to define bioethics and clinical ethics. So let's start with, what is bioethics?
Sure. So bioethics is a branch of what's sometimes called applied ethics, really the ethics of decisions that we should make about our moral responsibilities and rights and so on. So it studies, bioethics includes ethical issues in healthcare. It includes ethical issues in biomedical research on human participants. It includes, broadly speaking, our relationships with animals, and even environmental ethics is included in this broad field of bioethics. Now, clinical ethics is a more specific subfield within bioethics that deals with ethical issues in the therapeutic relationships that patients and healthcare professionals have with one another. That is where I have spent most of my career in talking about, thinking about, teaching about those issues.
So your impact then is in the clinical side is with those who are aspiring to be doctors. I gather, right?
That's right.
That's your students, your audience, right?
The
Yep.
students are a major audience. I also have taught clinic medical residents who are physicians who are still in training in
Yeah.
the hospital. Um, and as chair of the hospital's clinical ethics committee, I've offered a variety of continuing education programs for healthcare professionals who are, who are working here at the medical center and in other medical centers around our area, and giving them an opportunity for continuing education in bioethics.
Got to ask you, as a layman, technology. When we think technology, we usually think of computers and such. But I mean, the horizon for healthcare. I mean, think about just how we treat illnesses and so forth. So advances in medicine are ongoing.
Oh yes, indeed.
And so what I guess I'm wondering from a layman's standpoint, your guideline or whatever is deemed to be here are the ethical questions and the concerns of the day that we might have had in 1950 aren't the ones we had in 1980, and they're not the ones we have today. How frequently, take this wherever you want to go, but how frequently do we see things morph over time as new knowledge becomes available?
Yeah. So as you have suggested, Randy, there's been a tremendous change and growth in the field of healthcare in the United States and across the world, really, at least the developing world, in the last, I would say maybe 50 years or so. Tremendous increase in the types of treatments that are available to patients for a wide variety of illnesses. Tremendous increase in people's access to healthcare, what makes these issues important is that they're some of the most important decisions people make in their life. Decisions about care for serious illness, for example, and they're complex decisions. They're not easy to make. How do you decide, for example, what is the best approach to a new diagnosis of cancer? We've got several different options with different side effects and different likelihood of success. Those are difficult choices, and people need and seek advice about how to make those choices. So those are just some of the kind of things that I deal with, and that our ethics consultation service here at the medical center and at most medical centers are prepared to address.
And if you have comments or questions for John Moskop, put them in the chat area. Teddy in the blue room is keenly observing the chat area, and we'll keep an eye. Don't put them in the Q&A. Put them in the chat. Kidding. Teddy.
Hey, Randy, John, I have one of my daughters had a cat that was very ill, and I'm paralleling veterinarian services with human medicine because I think they parallel. They should, I believe, parallel fairly relevantly.
Yeah.
And she spent a lot of money seeking medical care for this cat before they ultimately put the cat down.
Yeah,
that was frustrating to her. But I said to her, I said, look, you asked a professional to help you figure out how to make your cat well. You didn't ask the professional to put the cat out of its misery. You asked him to help you make a cat well. And when she looked at it from that perspective, she looked at the involvement / even dollars at a different way.
Yeah. Many of us have pets, and of course, people in agriculture have animals that they rely on, and we are attached to our pets, and so it makes for some difficult choices about what to do when they have a serious illness. Some folks actually purchase health insurance for their pets so that they can cover those bills. And just one more comment,
Mhm.
There is an emerging concept in healthcare called One Health. And what the folks who are uh, proposing this concept have in mind is that the fields of healthcare for humans and veterinary care and even environmental health and ecological health are all linked in really important ways. So, for example, we're now having this tremendous heat wave across the world and in the United States, and that has really significant health consequences for a variety of people.
Yeah.
So environmental health affects personal health care. We
Hmm.
know from the pandemic that veterinary health and the diseases of animals
Mhm.
can affect humans. And that's apparently what happened in COVID. This started with animals and got transferred to humans and caused a tremendous global pandemic and upheaval. So,
Yeah.
so these are linked areas that we need to pay attention to.
You were mentioning you wanted to share a moment or two about your role in the medical center itself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. Um, so we already talked a little bit about the teaching,
Mhm.
and let me talk a little bit about the work of the hospital's clinical ethics committee. Um, it has three responsibilities, three charges. One is to provide what we call clinical ethics consultation, and we have a team of folks who are prepared to do that. And the idea here is that anybody who's involved in the care of a patient, including the patient, the patient's family, and the healthcare professionals, um, can seek advice and assistance when they're struggling with a difficult moral choice about that patient's care. And we stand ready to respond to those questions. We don't take over the decision-making responsibility. That remains with the folks who are primarily involved. But oftentimes we can help them think about the issues, help them maybe identify resources that they hadn't thought about, and if there's a conflict or a disagreement, sometimes we can help people find common ground to move forward with a plan of care for that patient. So that's one thing. Second thing that we do is we are responsible for maintaining and developing a small number of bioethics policies that are important for our medical center. For example, we have a policy about do not resuscitate orders or do not attempt resuscitation orders, which is a really important decision that needs to be made for people who have very serious illness, who are in the hospital. And so how do we make those decisions? What is the role of the patient and the family and the clinicians in doing that? That's just one example. The third thing that we do is provide continuing education, as I mentioned earlier. So we do that through our AHEC, our Health Education Committee here in Winston-Salem, so that folks who want to and actually need to get continuing education in bioethics can get that through noontime conferences, continuing education conferences in bioethics that we sponsor. So those are the three primary activities of our clinical ethics committee.
And Randy dropped off, which tells me that he didn't pay his internet bill, or he's having internet problems, but that's okay. We'll keep going. He'll come back, and he may just ran out the store to get a biscuit. But I'm with you, John. I mean, we can make decisions based on what we know and based on what we perceive.
Mhm.
But when we have a group of people who can help us be clear about what we know and clear about what we perceive, it can help us to make better decisions in our life and in our communities. And I like the One Health idea. I get that. We are only small little pieces of this huge entity called the Earth, and maybe even this bigger thing that we haven't got to yet. And so, why shouldn't they be aligned? I'm with you, and working together as groups. So,
yeah.
So anyway, well, I'll wait till he gets his audio back, and then I'll explain to him why he's not getting a pay raise. You back, buddy?
Teddy, did you not pay the internet bill? I don't know.
Yeah, I told you that was your responsibility, man.
Man, I tell you what, it's flickered on and off the last 3 weeks. And so anyway, I apologize. You guys froze up and I thought I was the only one carrying on. And then I realized that I was the odd man out. So
So
anyway,
go to your next point, man. We're good.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, you can do that. And one of the things I kind of wanted to understand was to walk through the process. You talked before, and maybe you guys covered this, but you talk through with patients and with their families and so forth, and offer up, I guess, options and things to consider. Kind of walk us through that process. Let's say Teddy is, well, let's say he's my loved one, and he's dealing with some real challenges. Kind of walk us through what that process might look like. Just give us that.
Yeah, I could do that. So the process here at Wake Forest Baptist, and I think this is similar to the process at many, if not most, medical centers, is that people who are struggling with a moral choice that they need to make, or it could be a moral conflict between folks who are involved in the care of a patient, or it could be just, this is so different, so unusual, I'm not sure what to do. I just don't know how to proceed. They can request an ethics consultation, and there's a phone number that they call to do that. And that phone number then is answered. That phone is answered by one of our patient representatives, who takes very simple, basic information and then passes that along to our lead ethics consultant, my colleague Gerardo Maradiaga. He will take that information. He will then do several things. Typically, he will respond to the patient, to the person who requested help, which most of the time is a healthcare professional, although it can be a family member, can be a patient. And collect more information about the situation, about, well, what is the question that you have? He will also typically review the patient's medical record to collect more information that's located in the notes about the patient. He will offer perhaps some initial suggestions for things that might be worth pursuing. And if the case is a little more complicated, he will suggest that let's sit down and have an ethics consultation meeting and talk through this case. We would typically invite the healthcare professionals who are involved in the patient's care, and very often also family members of the patient, and occasionally the patient, him or herself, although very often when these kinds of issues come up, the patient no longer has decision-making capacity. The patient is unconscious, or the patient has dementia or something like that, and so cannot actively participate in the discussion about the situation. So our goal in those meetings is to share information, to make sure everybody is on the same page, to listen to the concerns that are voiced by the interested parties. And that of course includes the family and the healthcare professionals, and see then if we can identify next steps that might help in reaching a decision about what is the right plan of care for the patient. Maybe finding common ground that would allow parties to proceed, maybe overcome some disagreements that they had, or maybe if they're just not sure what to do, we can say, well, look, here's what the way we've handled this situation in past cases, or something like that, and give them some guidance for ways they can move forward with the case. So that's the way that our medical center, and I think most medical centers, handle this opportunity for clinical ethics consultation. And this, by the way, is a service that is required by hospital accreditation commissions. So they say you need to have some way to address these issues when they arise in the care of your patients. Now, how it gets done it varies a little bit from hospital to hospital. The way it gets done in a big academic medical center like ours is very different than how it might get done in a, you know, a 20-bed rural hospital somewhere.
John, I found Wake Health EDU, patient and family resources, safety information and patient rights, bioethics.
Mhm.
And that's the clinical ethics consultation phone number on there. I just shared that with the group.
Yeah, yeah.
So cool.
Yep.
Yeah,
Good.
that's
Good.
good to share.
So it is accessible online. Yeah.
Let's pivot a little bit now and talk about your work in the classroom, if you will.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
as far as the bioethics courses for medical students, walk us through a little bit of the content and some of the format that you guys walk through.
Sure.
Yeah.
Glad to do that. I'll talk a little bit about format first.
Yeah.
My preferred way to teach this subject matter is in small groups, where we would assign readings to the students on the subject matter, and then discuss it in those small groups, maybe using case examples that pose questions for them. When we teach medical students, we also have them interview standardized patients to put them in a situation where an issue arises and they've got to decide, how do I handle this situation?
Okay.
I think that there are core topics, core content that every medical student should be introduced to and should be acquainted with, including what are the basic methods that we use to analyze ethics questions in healthcare? What's the relationship between law and ethics in healthcare decisions, and the relationship between cultural views and ethics in healthcare? What are the basic moral foundations of the relationship between patients and healthcare professionals? And in my book, I identify 6 of those.
Okay.
Privacy and confidentiality, truthfulness, truthful communication, obtaining informed consent to treatment, surrogate decision-making for patients who cannot make their own treatment decisions, professionalism. What does it mean to carry out your responsibilities in a professional way? And the last one that I talk about is resource stewardship. That is, how should clinicians make wise use of the limited resources that are entrusted to them? So that would include, at the very least, avoiding wasteful use of resources. So then the book talks about basic issues that arise in both the beginning of life and the end of life, or nearing the end of life, including assisted reproductive technologies and abortion and maternal fetal relationships, conflicts in some cases. That's beginning of life topics. Those are beginning of life topics. And also end of life topics include advanced care planning for serious illness, how to address moral conflicts in care near the end of life, the topic of medical futility. What role should that play in decisions about treatment near the end?
What is that? What is, John, what is medical futility?
Sure. 40 to 50 years ago, the major issue was that patients and their families should have the right to stop treatment that they believe was no longer beneficial. And that right was pretty much established. But then in the succeeding decades or so, patients and families began to demand what they saw as important life-sustaining treatments. And physicians pushed back and said, no, we don't believe we should offer that because we believe it would be futile. It wouldn't work. It wouldn't help your loved one survive any longer. So that was the issue of medical futility. In other words, should physicians and clinicians have the right to make a unilateral decision not to provide a treatment that a patient or family member requests on the grounds that that treatment just simply would not work?
I got you.
Is there a clear yes or no answer to that, John?
Well,
You got an hour?
yeah,
No,
yeah,
no, is there? Just simply is there? And
Yeah.
it probably
Yeah.
isn't.
yeah. Well, there are some clear examples. There are some clear examples that where a treatment has been thoroughly investigated and shown in a number of research studies that it just doesn't provide any benefit.
Yeah.
And so in those cases, we might want to say, well, yeah, we should honor that information and not provide those treatments any longer. But there are lots of cases where we don't have that kind of
Right. Yeah.
information to say this simply will not work. And so the question becomes, well, where should we draw the line? Where
Yeah.
should
Is
we
there
draw it?
fact or is there no fact? And do we have
Yeah.
enough facts to say,
Yeah,
bloodletting doesn't work anymore?
right. Or some kind of
Mhm.
cancer treatment that was offered at some point in time has clearly been shown to not have any benefit.
Hold the thought here for a second. Teddy, we're halfway through, but the thought I want to come back with is in the US versus, let's say, other countries where there's what I'll call universal health care.
Mhm.
And from what I read, and of course, I'm only being fed what I'm being fed. Decisions are made based simply on your age and some other factors in terms of the level of care provided. Again, given your age and life expectancy. And so I want to dive into that a little bit. But Teddy, we're halfway through.
Yeah, and I'll do halfway. I'll pick up some of these chats and I'll remind you,
Yeah.
Randy, I do not have a do not resuscitate order. Hey, you're on Lunch Conversations with Randy and Teddy. Those who don't know, I'm Teddy, and the guy in the yellow shirt is Randy. Our special guest today is Dr. John Moskop from Wake Forest. Atrium Health, Wake Forest. John, I noticed that I didn't have that written properly, dude. Yeah, John's with Atrium Health, Wake Forest Baptist Health. I think I've said it somewhat right. So
Soon to be changed again. I think the new name is going to be Advocate Health, because Atrium Health is combining with the Advocate Health system in the Midwest. So,
and the marketing people need more business. And so
yes.
the conversation today is about clinical ethics and bioethics. And this is a great conversation. John, I appreciate you showing up and participate with us today. And Randy, let me pick up on some of the chat so I can I can do this. And Don offers a concept, a question about ethical treatments and third-party reimbursers, insurance companies. When you're talking about payment for stuff and the cost of stuff, but I'm simplifying, medicine and care. How does that come into play? That whole third-party reimbursers and third-party services when it comes to ethical treatment. So, is there a conversation around that, the context of ethics? I'm assuming
there is indeed. It's a
Yeah.
complicated conversation. Randy mentioned earlier that unlike many other countries, we do not have universal access to healthcare here in this country.
Yeah. Interestingly, you didn't say yet, but that's okay.
Well, yeah, I think that's something we might want to think about in terms of what we hope for in the future. And I think one really important step that I hope will be taken in just the next few months is expansion of Medicaid here in North Carolina.
North Carolina, yeah.
Because that will provide access to health insurance and basic health care for, I can't remember how many 100,000 more people in North Carolina.
Yeah, and that's a big conversation, and I'm not advocating for an answer one way or another. But I do know that the more we care for people with federal and state dollars, the less we have to pay for those solutions later. We reduce all those long-term costs.
In at least some cases, and probably many cases, basic primary care may prevent the development of illnesses, which will be very expensive to care for when they arise later. So not every preventive measure can actually save money, but many of them
Yeah.
do have that potential. And
Yeah.
so,
Dan brought this up, John. Dan brought up, and you touched on a little bit, the whole conversation. You said the word planning, advanced aging, advanced age planning. And that
yes.
I'm only 65 years old, and I've been having those conversations with the right people, which means not on Facebook and Threads and Twitter for some time now, living will and advanced directives. And, just touch on that quickly, if you would, about in the context of, medical ethics.
You bet. I am a very strong believer in advanced care planning. I really think it's an important thing for people to do. It's one of the things that I would recommend that people consider and do for themselves.
Yeah.
And it's simple. It's not rocket science. All it really involves is, first of all, sitting down with your loved ones and sharing your thoughts about what kind of treatment you would want to have or not want to have if you became very seriously ill or terminally ill. And we recognize that people have different views there. Some folks would want very aggressive life-sustaining treatment, even if it was very onerous and difficult to undergo that treatment.
Yeah.
Others would say, no, I don't want those things. I want to be kept comfortable, and I want to be able to maximize my relationships with my loved ones.
Yeah.
And I think that palliative care interventions, and if I'm terminally ill, hospice care can do that for me.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important as the first step to have those conversations with your loved ones. And also, if you have a primary care physician and a good long-term relationship with that person as well.
Yeah.
And then I think it's important to formalize the decisions you have made. And one decision in particular, and that is, I think it's really important to choose the person whom you would want to make healthcare decisions for you if you become unconscious or become suffer from severe dementia, and you can't make decisions for yourself any longer. That is, in North Carolina, we call that person your healthcare agent. And one of the types of advanced directives that you can create actually simply designates who that person is. And of course, you want to have a clear and good conversation with that person so they understand your preferences, and you want to choose someone whom you think will honor your preferences in the appropriate circumstances.
We had Dennis Toman, Randy.
Yeah.
Remember
elder law.
The elder law. We had those conversations, and he talked about the 7 documents. There's 7 documents, and one of those is, your healthcare agent. It was another term as well, and
So let me add just a comment there. Many people do this as part of preparation of their will and sort of elder law concerns, but you don't have to. You don't have to engage an attorney to do this.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, we have developed in North Carolina, a group of us, a very simple advanced directive form that does, by most accounts, virtually all accounts, meet the requirements of our state statutes. Yeah. That does those important things. Yeah. It designates who you want to be your healthcare agent. It also, the other document that is recognized in North Carolina is called a living will. And in North Carolina, that living will is fairly narrow and specific. It basically allows you to say, if I am in one of these 3 medical conditions, terminally ill, permanently unconscious, or severely demented, I do not want life-sustaining treatment used to prolong my life. Yeah. So our living will, the simplified living will we've developed, basically in like 4 pages, allows you to say, here's my healthcare agent, and here's my decision about whether I do or do not want life prolonging measures in that. those.
I'm going to look later on and find that document, John, and if it is in fact a public document on Wake Forest's.
Yeah, well, it's widely disseminated, and many, if not most, of North Carolina healthcare facilities have chosen to.
Okay.
Here's why. There is also in the North Carolina statutes model documents for appointment of a healthcare agent and for the living will, but they're much longer and a little bit more legalese type language. And so our preference was to say, look, less is more. Let's make it simple. Let's make it easy for people to complete these documents.
Cool.
And I think, Teddy, one way to get at them is to Google got plans 1, 2, 3.
Okay.
I think that those forms will come up.
Sounds good.
That's
Okay.
the website. So, and then there's one more thing. There's a page. North Carolina is one of only a few states that says, look, if you're going to do these in the way that our statutes recognize, you have to have 2 witnesses. You have to sign it. You have to have 2 witnesses who sign it, and you have to have those signatures notarized. So those are requirements that would make it sort of official in the North Carolina scheme. Most other states don't require both of those things to happen, but North Carolina does.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say we can pivot a bit here. We talked about I'll call it rationed healthcare in some other countries with universal healthcare.
Sure.
So how does that tie into bioethic? Let's hit on some of these hot buttons that we kind of teased about at the beginning.
Okay.
So that is one of them. And that's one of the hot button things about universal healthcare is, hey, and I've got a cousin who's 82 and they won't treat him for whatever because of his age, kind of thing.
Yeah.
How do you guys sift through those issues?
Well, those are really, really complicated issues.
Ready, set, go.
Yeah. We don't have, a standardized national system that addresses those issues. We have a patchwork system, right? We have for folks who are 65 and older, Medicare, which covers most of their health insurance needs, although not all. And of course, you have to pay premiums for drugs and so on. We have Medicaid, which is a similar system, but it's for people who cannot otherwise afford health care for various reasons. And so they're sort of income requirements that you have to meet in order to be eligible for Medicaid. Most people in the United States get their health insurance through their employer and pay a premium or not, depending on what their employer requires. So it's a patchwork system, and these different sources of health insurance cover somewhat different kinds of health care and with somewhat different costs and somewhat different reimbursement for the folks who provide health care. So it's really complicated. There are people who fall through the cracks and don't have coverage. And that's why I said earlier that I think expansion of Medicaid in North Carolina will be very important because it will fill some of those gaps that currently exist. And North Carolina is one of only, I think, about 4 or 5 states, less than 10 states, that have not expanded access to health insurance through Medicaid for people who cannot afford it by themselves. Now, compared to other countries, there are many, virtually all other developed nations have systems which cover virtually everyone in their system for basic health care. And interestingly enough, at a lower cost than we spend for healthcare here in the United States. Now, how do they do that? Well, a variety of ways. They may, for example, the United Kingdom limits the reimbursement of new technologies that they don't believe are worth the cost. If the cost is very high and the benefit is very modest. And in the United States, some private, health insurers do the same thing. But other, some folks who want those treatments say, well, but I want it, and I should get it, even if it's very costly, and even if the benefits are very modest. But if we do that for every new treatment that offers even a modest benefit, that's not really financially sustainable in the long term. We can't control the costs in a way that we can keep the system operating. And there are lots of pressures, as you all know, on our healthcare systems.
Yeah.
They got much worse, of course, when COVID hit. There's major reliance on our systems to provide care for patients with COVID. And at the same time, we were losing healthcare professionals because of the challenges of care under COVID. So this is just a hugely complicated question.
It is. And John, I have to kind of compare it a little bit to the automobile. And there's an acceptable death rate. I'll call it that. I mean, we could make a car that you could virtually never die in unless you're as bad a driver as Teddy. But then the cost would be astronomical. And so same thing when it comes to safety things, there's a cost, and there's what I'll call an acceptable accident rate. And that's probably not the term for it, but we can't live our life in a bubble. So you have to make those tough decisions. Again, we only read what we read and hear what we hear from people on both sides of any issue. So it's always interesting to kind of get a read on it from your perspective. Let's hit a couple other hot button issues.
Okay.
Everybody's aware of things like healthcare as a right, which kind of ties into what you just said.
Yeah.
So anything else to add real quick on that before we move on to a couple other ones?
Well, yeah. So we have not quite embraced the idea that healthcare is a right that everyone should have access to. We're moving in that direction through expansion of Medicaid and so on.
Yeah.
But let's say we're closing in on that. But even so, the question then becomes, does that mean that there's a right to all healthcare? Does that mean there's a right to cosmetic surgeries, for example? That's healthcare.
Hair transplants, maybe? Did I hear you say hair transplants?
And there you go. And so we need to define, if we decide that we want to recognize a right to healthcare, what that entails. What are the kinds of healthcare that are that we ought to provide to everyone as a right, and what are kinds of healthcare that are not basic and might be available to folks who want to invest in them and can invest in them, but are not something that we need to provide to everybody. And that could include cosmetic surgeries. It could also include what I was talking about earlier, these very, very expensive new chemotherapies, for example, that provide a modest benefit, maybe a couple of extra months of life, but at a very high cost. Are we going to say everybody should get those if they choose to?
And in the context of ethics, there are my new word I'm using, a plethora of opinions.
There are indeed.
What I should get, what I shouldn't get, what all of that. And and I get it. I mean, there are people who will say, I need cosmetic surgery so that I can continue living a sustainable life in the model I have been living in, et cetera, et cetera. And it's hard to argue with people who bring up, I'm careful to say this, who bring up a valid conversation around why.
And there are fuzzy borders. We might say, look, cosmetic surgery are people who have had injuries and who need reconstruction of their faces or something like that. Well, that is something that really is essential, but maybe not
for
a beauty pageant.
For a beauty pageant or for hair replacement, or
you know what? By the way, we had actually an old college friend of mine, Dan Leonard, was on a few weeks ago, and he is a past president of a couple national associations. The names escape me off the top of my head, but his thing is what I'll call, and I'm putting words in these are my words, not his, but generic, medicines, and money drives the bus on this thing big time behind the scenes, and what gets prescribed and what doesn't. And those middlemen, and I forget the name of it, but the ones that negotiate and all that in the middle, and, follow the money. And I think
Yes, I remember his talk, and it was very interesting about how the pharmaceutical companies benefit from those special discounts that are provided to the
Interesting.
patients.
Yeah, it'd make your head spin. Hey,
Yeah.
we got a few minutes, so let me try to get your take on a couple things. One is this: I mean, we're all human. We all have our own views, our own personal views, whether it's politics, religion, healthcare. What Red Sox player should we have picked up in the trade deadline but didn't, and all of those things. We all have opinions on those. So how do you counsel your students and others that you come in contact with to say, hey, let's put, I guess, how do you keep your personal views off to the side? And we're human. So do you ever see that kind of creeping in and sort of trying to influence people? And how do you guard against that? And how do you counsel those to say, hey, we need to keep that line of delineation there?
Yeah. It's obvious that we live in a pluralistic society.
Yeah.
People have a variety of different beliefs and values and goals. So we're not all going to agree on, what kinds of medical treatment near the end of life, for example, should be provided. And that's what makes it difficult to resolve some of these decisions. There's no simple answer like, oh, well, the patient is always right, or no, the doctor is always right. There are negotiations that I think have to happen in these situations, and decisions that have to be made about whether this is a reasonable request that the patient is making for a treatment that the healthcare team doesn't recommend but is willing to provide, versus a request that the healthcare team says, look, this is just so contrary to the standard of care that we must abide by, that we cannot honor your request. So those are the kinds of complex situations that we try to help out with when we get requests for ethics consultation. And there's not a single simple answer that we can offer, because
there's no cheat sheet. There's no game plan written down for us to go, let's look at page 7. This is what we do.
Yeah.
And as we're getting close to wrapping up, I would offer that just because Dan has an artificial knee, 2 rotor cuff surgeries, cataract surgery, and a stent bypass in his leg, and maybe he is old, but I'm okay with him reaching out for medical support to keep him going. So, Randy?
Yeah, one of the things that I do with our clients with our Goodwill Professional Center, I consider it almost, I'm no attorney, but I kind of consider myself from the attorney standpoint. The attorney doesn't tell you what you have to do. The attorney tries to give you the pros and cons of your different choices. And armed with that information, hopefully you make better informed decisions. And if I'm hearing you, I think you're kind of along that same game plan, is to make them aware of options and perhaps pros and cons of each of those. And they then arrive at that decision.
Yeah.
Hopefully, with more information.
That is, I think, definitely what we propose to do, what we hope to offer. Now, of course, attorneys will say, but there are laws that address some of these issues.
Sure.
And so, I want to inform you about what might be the legal boundaries of decisions that you might choose to make. And we have ethics policies and other policies in our hospital that also set some guidelines for us that we are required to honor. And if we don't honor them, we will certainly be called to task by the folks who review our work and say, look, you had a policy that said you would do this. You didn't do it. So you need to fix that. So those are some of the guidelines. But I would hasten to add that there are many, many cases where there is no law. There is no hospital policy that dictates what should be done. And that's where we need to think together about, what's the best course of action and what can we agree on? And is there a compromise that's possible that would satisfy all of the interested parties in a patient's care?
Yeah. So we're getting real short on time. If you got a quick takeaway or two, that'd be great. Something you'd like us to remember.
Well, let me just come back to my plea to think about pursuing advanced care planning. This is most important, I think, for older folks who have chronic or serious illnesses, and also have really clear views about what kind of care they would and would not want, because advanced care planning can help them ensure that they get the care that they want and don't get care they don't want. So that's one suggestion I would make to folks. It's not that younger folks can't do this. Of course, we all can have catastrophic illnesses that come or injuries that come suddenly. But I would say it's maybe less urgent for those folks. And then, the other thing that I would say is let's hope that and suggest to our legislators that they enact a budget in order that we can move forward with Medicaid expansion this year in North Carolina. I think there's now bipartisan support that we should do this, but it depends on finalizing a state budget. And so that's the step that has to happen first. So I'm hopeful that will happen. We'll have to leave those more difficult questions about limits, I think, for a future day.
Got you. John Moskop, thank you for joining us today. John, by title, and it's a long title, so why don't you give the title, because you threw a new name at me that I wasn't aware of. So maybe not going to be Atrium for a whole lot longer. So help us understand what is this, and how big is a business card now? This big?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I wish I were. I think this is still something in transition. But
Okay.
The latest word is that Atrium Health, which has got multiple institutions here in North Carolina, also South Carolina and Georgia, is entering into, I guess, a kind of merger or affiliation agreement with a health system that is based in Illinois and Wisconsin. That has the title. Part of the title was Advocate Health. So my understanding is that is the title that will eventually be used by the combined health system. So my role is just as a professor of general internal medicine, and as I have a chair, the Mona Wallace and Mona Wood Chair in Biomedical Ethics at the Medical Center.
Thank you, John. You serve at Wake Forest University School of Medicine, professor of internal medicine. Teddy, we've got just a moment or two left. Any quick thoughts? I've got an idea on our next week's guest, and so I can share that. Anything we need to
I echo what John spoke about. You've heard me say this before. Get those 7 documents nailed down, get that living will, get that that medical agent nailed down. It's important to do. And I'm at that age where I'm serving that older generation, and I'm preparing to become that older generation. No comments from Randy. And so this is important for me to pay attention to and learn while I help others, so that I can get my daughters to help me, and hope that they do. And I believe they will. So John, thank you very much for showing up. I really appreciate it. Lots of good content. Randy, you got
next week on the 9th of August, we'll have Shawan Gabriel. Shawan is the executive director. I think that's his title. I could be wrong. Forgive me, CEO, president, executive director, but he's the top guy over at Big Brothers Big Sisters here. And Forsyth County. I've gotten to know him and also his team over the last couple of years. And so he's going to be in to talk about all the good work that Big Brothers Big Sisters does, not just here in our area, but elsewhere around the country. And they just actually won some big award. So we'll talk about that as well. So that'll come up next week on the 9th, Teddy.
Cool. Cool. Again, Randy, thanks a lot. John, good to see you.
Thank you, John.
For joining us. Thanks to our audience for participating. We love you guys showing up, and we want to make sure we're constantly bringing you what conversations that can be helpful to you. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Thanks to you fellas for having me.
Thanks, John.
Bye.
Mhm.